Hudson Link partners with different colleges across New York to serve over 600 incarcerated students in correctional facilities and has welcomed over 850 alumni back to their communities. My name is Cruceta and I am one of the academic coordinators for Hudson Link. I run a program at a men's medium security facility in upstate New York that offers associate's degrees. I am also proud to say that I am an alumni of the program. I earned my degree while serving a 7.5-year prison term in one of New York State's maximum security facilities. My colleague Rachel Bernard and I, also an academic coordinator for Hudson Link, are here to talk about some of our experiences in implementing college programs inside prisons, as well as the successes and challenges of replicating the campus experience in these programs. The other week, I was trying to fall asleep and I thought, is it even possible to replicate the college experience inside prison? In many ways, the answer is no. But there are ways we as program directors can transform the environment of our students into one where they can learn and thrive. Our plan is to share some of our best practices and tools for program implementation, specifically academic advising, community building, and creating a culture of accountability. We will also share some of our challenges in this work and leave plenty of time for questions and discussion.
Great. So as Lee mentioned, I'm also a Hudson Link academic coordinator, and I've coordinated programs at both men's and women's medium and maximum security facilities. I also used to work for Marymount Manhattan College, running their college program at Bedford Hills. I've actually had the experience of running a college program, not just on behalf of a college directly, but also now working for a nonprofit. And I'd like to share that regardless of who's employing me, there's a lot that's the same. And I describe the role of an inside college program administrator akin to being a representative of every kind of department or office in a college. Some days I'm an academic advisor, some days I'm the registrar, sometimes I'm career counseling, and sometimes health and wellness, all into kind of one role. And I believe that it's our job to replicate the campus experience as much as possible, while of course acknowledging the unique reality of our students, but also maintaining the standards and rigor of main campus. And I think academic advising is a crucial piece of that process. So at Hudson Link, our goal is to help as many of our students get their degree before they go home. And that's the same transfer credit policies that exist on our college partner campuses also apply to our inside students. So we work with the student to obtain any official transcripts they might have received, credits they might have earned before they came to prison, or even in a different prison education program in New York State. And then we work with the colleges to assess the degree audits and make sure that we are offering courses that are based on the outstanding degree requirements student needs to complete their degree. And we make sure that students are informed about their academic progress the same way that they would on main campus. Neither Lee nor I use a cohort model in our medium correctional facilities. While a cohort model allows for simpler academic advising and course planning and sometimes stronger group connectivity, it doesn't make sense in a medium facility where the length of stay is anywhere from 2 to 4 years. Additionally, a cohort model doesn't allow for individualized paces of learning or allows students to come in and out of the program as they often need to do in a correctional setting due to circumstances beyond their control. When advising students, it's essential that we have individual discussions regarding the student's interest, their career goals, their release dates, and their reentry plans in order to create the best academic plan for the student. For those who will be released before completing their degree, we advise them on schools in the area they are returning to that will be affordable and practical for them. Sometimes this involves us doing research as our students are released across the whole state. And sometimes this requires us to make introductions for them or meet them on campus and help them actually go through the application transfer process. We also help students apply for financial aid, but knowing and preparing together for release is an important part of the academic advising process.
I tell my students that reentry prep should have started the minute they were sentenced and heading to a state facility. I like to ask my students what their goals are and what they expect to gain from a college degree. Although a college degree may open the doors of opportunity upon release, many obstacles await them. Some of those obstacles may include lack of housing options, family structure, and employment. We've found over the last 21 years that the one field that is most open to hiring formerly incarcerated individuals is the social service field. Not only are they open to hiring our students upon release, it's the one field in which our experience inside prison are actually seen as an asset. For our alumni that do not have the supportive family that is essential to successful reentry, we have monthly alumni gatherings that allow them to network with others who have gone through the reentry process and can offer guidance. These alumni gatherings also serve as an avenue to employment, since many of our alumni are working for social service providers throughout the city and state. As part of our alumni services, we provide alumni with a laptop and business attire upon release to prepare them for job searches and interviews. In this way, we do our best to ensure our alumni are released on the best foot possible, providing them with the guidance and resources necessary for successful reentry.
So another area we want to touch on is community building and accountability. We believe that supplemental programming can really enhance and enrich prison education programs. These kind of beyond the classroom opportunities not only replicate the college experience, but create opportunities for community building. This includes academic lectures, plays, workshops, student newsletters, literary magazines, study halls, computer labs, and peer mentoring programs. These can also be a great way to bring outside faculty or college staff into the facility for a one-time event and increase contact between the inside and outside campuses. It's also a good way to build interest and support for the prison education program on main campus. These kinds of opportunities provide space and time for students inside the prison to build relationships with one another, but it's worth saying that while programs can be designed to create the space and opportunity, community building must be student-led and student-driven. Lee's going to talk a little bit more about how prison education programs can inspire students to take ownership and accountability.
Thank you. Having had the experience of being both a student and a coordinator of the college program, I can offer a unique perspective. The culture in men's prisons is often one that promotes individuality and privacy and celebrates toughness. I witnessed firsthand how the college program breaks down those walls and can allow real bonds between students to form and flourish. In my experience, it takes a couple of semesters for students to feel comfortable and for the student community to come together. During my first semester, no one would even talk to each other, but midway through the second semester, there was an entirely different feeling. People were building off one another, connecting in the classroom and outside the classroom. This shift was largely due to the fact that my cohort was allowed to have our own unsupervised math study halls on Saturday afternoons. One of my classmates, who was far more advanced in math, led our studies. Within weeks of us meeting in this study group, our classroom culture started to evolve. We became more mindful of each other, and we all agreed that we would not move on in the curriculum during study group until we were confident that we were all ready to move on as a team. This sense of community and accountability for each other and our program spread into our housing units. We soon found ourselves making plans to spend our recreation time studying, brainstorming together, as well as critiquing each other's papers for other courses. Now, as a coordinator of a program, I can only hope that my students feel the same connection to each other and sense of accountability to the program as I did. At the facility I work in, Green, we opened a computer lab, which will provide a space for students to connect, share, and learn from one another in the way my math study hall did. Before the lab opened, one of my student leaders approached me with a list of concerns regarding login procedures, sign-in sheets, and computer policies. Despite the fact that my organization and I had already made a plan addressing these policies and procedures, the significance of this encounter was the student was taking an interest in how the lab was going to be run and operated. He wanted to ensure that it was being set up in a way that would meet doc security concerns and protect the program. This is the sense of the sense of accountability that can allow a program to thrive and be successful. The value of a college community is so powerful that some programs are designed to house all college students in the same dorm. There are advantages to this in that students can be surrounded by like-minded individuals who are interested in bettering themselves. It also gives students more opportunities to work and study together to better their education experience. On the other hand, the argument can be made that college students can make more of an impact and serve as greater role models if they live amongst the larger prison community. At Green, the students have the option of living in the college dorm. We emphasize the importance of forming authentic relationships among students, leading to a deeper sense of community and an enhanced learning experience.
So as promised, we also want to discuss some of our greatest challenges to running programs inside. Bridging academic and security needs is always a challenge in this work. Prison policies and procedures can often be frustrating to faculty who are used to teaching in a 21st century classroom. And this is just one of the reasons I often say that just because a professor is an effective professor on main campus, it doesn't mean they're necessarily an appropriate fit for the correctional facility campus. And it's important that while we of course do everything we can to ensure our professors have the materials they need, that our professors are understanding of the technological limitations of the prison classroom and are able to embrace a go with the flow kind of attitude that's so essential to working inside. It's our responsibility, I think, as program administrators to screen potential faculty and assess if they're going to be a good fit for the prison program. Asking why a professor is interested in teaching is an important question and places you, the administrator, in the position of assessing a professor's motives for taking an interest in the program. This could easily launch a conversation about what the right reasons, if there are any, for getting involved in this work, which I don't really want to get into, but I will share that my personal feeling is that we have a responsibility to ensure professors are professional, qualified, and not there solely for promoting their own careers or research in a way that will somehow exploit our students. I believe it's also on us to provide supplementary training to new faculty, and that this training should involve much more than just an overview of prison policies and procedures, but information about boundary setting and how power, privilege, and gender dynamics play out in the prison classroom. And this is an area that I think also demonstrates the value of having formally incarcerated and non-formally incarcerated staff. Because of our different backgrounds and experiences, we can really provide a unique training and support to faculty and students.
Being a formerly incarcerated program coordinator has its advantages and its challenges. When it comes to building relationships with students, it's invaluable as we are able to connect with and understand their reality like no one else. We are also in a position to advise faculty by providing them with relevant information that is helpful in navigating the prison classroom environment. Being a formerly incarcerated program coordinator can also have its advantages when it comes to building professional relationships within the facility. As an alumni of the program, I became extremely familiar with DOC's directives, policies, and procedures. This allows me to explain in detail the ins and outs of DOCs to professors and students. It also provides the facility administration with reasonable assurance that the rules will be communicated and enforced. Despite what some may think, the New York State Department of Corrections actually looks favorably upon having formerly incarcerated program administrators. Many of the superintendents and prison administrators we work with are people my colleagues and I knew from our time inside. I will say that there are some staff members who are not always as trusting of formerly incarcerated coordinators, and personally this has caused some discomfort. This can prove to be an obstacle in performing my duties as an administrator. Just a few weeks ago, I called Rachel after an altercation with an officer had me angry and frustrated. Having her remind me that my current role as a program administrator allows me to go beyond corrections to perform my duties. So even though being a formerly incarcerated leader has its advantages, it also remains as one of my biggest ongoing challenges in this work. Walking into prison every day after having lived there for 7.5 years is not always easy. Additionally, something as simple as the jingle of keys, the slamming of gates, or the musty smell can trigger me and make me think that I'm back in D Block. Couple that with the fact that I'm on parole and have only been home 3 short years. Reminding myself of the purpose of this work helps, and so does the support of my formerly and non-formerly incarcerated colleagues. To end, we just want to reiterate this idea that the campus experience can be replicated by making sure students are informed participants in their education and receive ongoing academic advising and support, in addition to creating opportunities for community building through extracurricular activities, events, and study halls. During this community building process, a culture of accountability and ownership of the program can be created and encouraged, allowing your program to thrive. We look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel and Lee. We'll move on to Mary Gould.
Sure, thanks. Can I use the, okay, I don't think I'm as skilled as everyone. I prefer not to. Sure. Thank you. My name is Mary Gould. I'm the interim director of the Alliance for Higher Education in Prison. I initially submitted my proposal to this event with the title, Building the Field, Theories and Practices of Higher Education in Prison. But as I've been working on this presentation and continuing to engage my work, collaborating to build a national network to support higher education and the higher education in prison community, I think I'd prefer this talk exist under the title, A Networked Approach to Building the Field of Higher Education in Prison. So this presentation centers on my thinking around the ideas of field building, networked learning, and communities of practice. And I very much look forward to our conversation. That a national network focused on the global needs of higher education in prison stakeholders could sustain and grow programs and help ensure that incarcerated learners have access to high quality educational opportunities. The Alliance for Higher Education in Prison was founded because people teaching and learning in prison knew that there were not enough high quality in prison higher educational opportunities, and that students in prison were susceptible to low quality or predatory practices. But in order to address the inequity in access and quality and the scarcity of resources, networking, and collaboration within the higher education and prison community, there is significant work to do, much of which is the unglamorous task of theorizing the practices of higher education in prison, to define the nature, the scope, and purpose of this work so that we can effectively engage in conversations about what equitable access and high quality programming looks like for practitioners and students. So in other words, the field of higher education in prison is very much still emerging. And what we need is a collective way forward to build the field of higher education in prison. So what I suggest today is that this way forward requires a network approach, and that we should be envisioning our end goal as the formation of a community of practice. The characteristics of a network approach that are most appealing to me are strong connections with and among people and information, active and sustained communication, especially across differences, supportive co-learning, a relational stance, so that learning takes place in relationship to others and in relationship to materials and resources, and that this process is descriptive and generative and not prescriptive or destructive. So what this effort requires is building connections, trust, opportunities for collaboration, and a shared appreciation for co-learning. So first, we're going to be asked to work together to address some of these big questions that will help us with a shared language for the field of higher education in prison. Questions such as, what is higher education in prison? What is the purpose of higher education in prison? How do we know when we are doing higher education in prison well? In this process, in answering these questions, we will have challenges and opportunities. So that's what I'm going to spend most of my time talking about today, are both the challenges and opportunities. And I will make the best effort to be optimistic, and I will end with opportunities. So I'll start with the challenges. One of the great challenges for stakeholders working in the field of higher education in prison is the perception of a scarcity of resources, and that programs need to compete with and not support each other. We have faced years of funding initiatives that have saturated the field with underperforming programs eager to provide return on investment and scalable programming. So right there, return on investment and scalable programming, problematic language. We have many practitioners who can see that they can, another fine phrase to put brackets around, do more with less. That seems to be a concept that often is spoken by many practitioners and programs. So that could be, we could forgo salaries for program leadership or teachers. We can do much of what's happening on campuses around the country, and adjunctification of teaching and higher education. Programs and practitioners are now being asked to be grateful for a federal funding program that has already created a money grab and encouraged some of the worst behaviors from higher education institutions, driven by the desire for more students to combat declining enrollments on the outside campus without any quality oversight to support incarcerated students. We have university administrators across campuses who do not acknowledge higher education in prison programs as equal to their programs or department counterparts on campus, often treating higher education in prison programs as passion or service projects. Across the practitioner community, many have used this lack of transparency, consistency in practice, professionalization, networking, and resource sharing to our advantage, and have created utopian visions of colleges and universities that don't follow the standards, practices, or protocols of what is at least minimally required on outside campuses. By not leading with more holistic language around the purpose and outcomes of higher education in prison, by leaning so heavily on recidivism as the measure of success, by not asking robust questions about what higher education in prison is and what are high quality practices, by not collaborating and engaging in thoughtful discourse among the practitioner community, and by not offering recommendations for better measures of success. Many of us in the field have collaborated and been part of the problem that has created an underclass of students in prison. A class of students who researchers, policymakers, college administrators, and the philanthropic community and the broader public have come to think that they have the insight and right to determine the amount, often termed as dosage, and quality of education someone in prison should receive. In other words, what has been created and what we must now reverse is the existence of a group of students who are seen as deserving of high quality educational opportunities, and a group of students, in this case, speaking specifically about incarcerated students, who are seen as deserving of better than nothing educational opportunities. So here's the optimistic part. Here are our opportunities. As we engage work to ensure quality in the pursuit of supporting learning in prison, we also have the opportunity to articulate the practices that should define quality in higher education more broadly. In some ways, the emerging field of higher education in prison is already ahead of colleges and university campuses across the country, who are just now starting to pay attention to the quote-unquote non-traditional student, as they are actually now becoming the norm on campuses across the country, or likely already are the norm. Older students, returning students, students with children, students working one or more jobs, first-generation students, veterans, and many other demographic categories that challenge the idealized image of the student who enters college directly after high school. In fact, our students in prison, categorically, are more in alignment with the current cohort of students on college and university campuses across the country at all types of institutions, so 2- and 4-year institutions alike. So as we develop our thinking on what quality higher education looks like for students in prison, in fact, we are providing a set of practices and metrics for all higher education institutions across the country. So the opportunities that we have is to define assessment metrics and outcomes that are holistic and that focus on the whole person. We can clearly distinguish higher education in prison from correctional education. We can, as my colleague Aaron Castro has said before, and perhaps might say tomorrow, recidivism is not an educational outcome. And we must reinforce that recidivism is not the language of higher education in prison in the same way that it might be a measure for corrections, and should be. We can collectively reject outcome-oriented assessment as the sole indicator of success, as Jody Lewin described this morning. Completion measures, graduation rates, employment, employability, and/or recidivism. We can do this for our students in prison as well as on traditional campuses. I recommend that we instead take a values-oriented approach to assessment and measures of student success, that programs engage in rigorous strategic planning in advance of starting programs and throughout the course of the existing programs, that they ask what value added do we expect from our students and how will we measure these outcomes. We should be asking what has improved in a student's capabilities, knowledge, skills as a consequence of their education. In other words, what difference did the program make for the student, regardless of whether they will return to the community or not. We have the opportunity to share data and information and resources among and across our community in an effort to raise the quality of all programs, and we can be a collective voice in rejecting utilitarian and outcome-oriented rationales for this work. As we work to grow the field, I hope that we can continue to find spaces like this one to pause and contemplate the many framing questions that we have still not answered, and to collaborate and engage in co-learning. I believe if we can do these things, we might also be able to build a field and, more important, a networked community of practice. So thank you for this time to think and share.
Thank you so much, Mary. We'll turn it over to Betty Abbott.
Usually I don't use these things because my voice is loud enough. I found out that Julie misses my voice in the office now. I'm Betty Abbott. I was in corrections education for 21 years, 5 years in New Mexico, 16 years here in Wyoming. And I'm actually here today to represent CEA, which is a Correctional Education Association. And I want to give you a little bit of history of Correctional Education Association. In 1937, there was a Friends of Prison Libraries and Correctional Education. It was founded, and the first correctional education journal was written. It wasn't published, but it was written. In 1941, the first standards were developed with education, and in 1957 there were 9 standards in the ACA manual. And for those of you who don't know what ACA is, the American Correctional Association, and it's a manual that guides a practice in prisons, everything from security to education to programming to facilities management, etc. Today in the ACA standards there are 14 measures. CEA has its own standards commission where we go out and audit different programs, and then ACA accepts our outcomes. And we have 31 standards for adult and juvenile education. So it's much more comprehensive than just the standard ACA. 1945, Austin McCormick and others were attending the 76th APA Congress, which was the previous name for ACA, and they formed what was to become CEA. So in 1946, CEA was officially established, and Price Chenault from New York was actually the very first president of CEA. The journal was published in 1947, and in 1965, the dues to join were $2, which back in '65 was probably a lot of money. In 1973, CEA held its first conference in Seattle, Washington. And in 1981, Osa Coffee became the first executive director, and they had an office in the DC area. Part of that was because there was a lot of legislation that needed to be addressed, and so she placed the office there so that she could have access to the legislature and those powers that be to try and help with funding. Our current office is still in Maryland, but due to some changes in CEA, we don't necessarily have to keep an office in Maryland. And I'll kind of go into that in a few minutes. 1982, the Council of Directors was formed, and I can tell you, as a previous director of special or correctional education, for me, that was probably the most important part of me joining CEA. I joined back in 1997 when I worked in New Mexico, and in about 2004, I really got involved with the Council of Directors as their vice president, president, and then the representative to the board. This comprised all the people in the states who were directors. This is juvenile and adult directors. We always had invited guests. We worked with the feds, but having access, and you're talking about trying that partnership, having access to people in other states who were running programs, who struggled with a lot of the same things that I was struggling with, was so helpful to me, because I could pick up the phone and call and say, hey, you did XYZ in your state. How did you do it? How did it work? What were the pitfalls? Because quite frankly, I don't want to reinvent the wheel. If somebody's already got it rolling, I'm more than happy to latch onto it. By the same token, as we developed things in Wyoming, we shared a lot of what we did at the council meetings. We did a special ed operations manual many years ago, and I can't count how many states I've given that to. Because a lot of states are like, man, I don't know what to do in adult corrections for special ed. It's like, well, guess what? The federal law requires you to do a whole lot more than you think. And so having that group to share that information with was just, it was an exceptional opportunity for me to learn. And it's kind of interesting because, you know, when you're in a program, you always think, oh my God, I could do so much better. And then you go and you find out, dang, we're doing pretty good. I mean, we really were. And I said earlier that I told staff at the Department of Corrections here that I would hold our programs up to anybody in the U.S. And I guarantee that I can hold them up, and I still would, and have Haley do the same thing. And I encouraged Haley, as the new director over there, that she has to get involved with this group because it's one of the most important resources you will ever have. Wisconsin was actually the first state chapter. And then in 1988, when we published our standards through the commission, and they have to charge, obviously, for the audit because you have to pay people to travel and you have to do all that. But there's 31 standards, and it's really hard to meet all those standards. And I'm an auditor. I've done audits in different states, and it's really kind of, more of it's kind of personal interest because you get to go to different places and find out what everybody else is doing and go, oh, that's a really good idea. If we did this, or they ask you at the end, hey, I know you officially can't say do X, Y, Z, but you know, what did you do to make this work? And that was just really, really helpful to me. CEA's biggest goals is professional development because there's so much that changes in correctional ed and in education across the board that you really have to maintain all your professional development. We do every area in correctional ed, vocational, special ed, juvenile, adult. I think our weakest area is post-secondary. I had a conversation with Rachel, and you and I will have a conversation too, because I think as I'm seeing more and more states really go into the post-secondary, Pell Grants are now in, I think, the third or fourth year of the grant. And so they're studying to see, is this going to make a difference? But I think you can still do things even without it. But I think that tie-in with post-secondary is really, really important to CEA, and we want to keep moving forward. One of our other goals is to increase public awareness of correctional education. You know, it's one thing, and the director and I used to have conversations about this. It was, you know, it's easy to go in and sell a preschool program, but when you go in and try and sell a program for a bunch of adults who are convicted of felonies, there's not a lot of people who will listen. And so when you talk about outcomes, trying to figure out those outcomes, not only that satisfy us as educators and as researchers, but also can help sell those programs is essential to be able to do. Again, I think the networking opportunities in CEA are probably the biggest part, and then we also do the benchmarks and the standards for the accreditation. So our real mission is to empower our members to provide, and I had to laugh, this was the word, was transformational learning opportunities for those people that we work with. And that's actually on our website. About 5 years ago, CEA kind of underwent some changes. We ended up like in the hole financially, like to the tune of about 150 grand. And there was $10,000 in the budget. And when you're looking as a board at that and you're thinking, great, now what do we do? The board stuck together, and I have to say that we've come around. We are now looking at the potential to hire another executive director, because in the past couple of years, it's been only the board that has been doing all the work for CEA. And I have absolutely no clue how I did that when I was working full-time, because I've been the vice president for 4 years. And so bringing an organization back like that, you have to have a passion for that, because if you don't have the passion, you're not going to put in the energy to make that work. There's 8 regions in CEA. We actually had 9, and then we combined some. Different regions have different activity levels. The region you guys are in New York is pretty active, because you've got huge states, you've got a lot of money, you've got a lot of buy-in from the community. This region is a little bit smaller. You've got Montana, Idaho, Washington, Oregon, British Columbia, and Alberta. So we're not real active. I've been asked if I would be willing to reactivate it, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I've got the energy to do that yet, but I'll decide that later. We partnered with the RAND Corporation. They've done studies on correctional ed. We partnered with the Vera Institute. As a matter of fact, I was just calling them and talking with them to ask for some of their studies and their research to kind of help me with another project that I'm working on. But our goal is to make sure that correctional educators, from our vocational teachers to ABE to post-secondary to college accredited programs, have the resources that they need. And then if we need to be that mouthpiece to go into the legislature and talk with them, I think that's a really important part. On a note aside, we were talking about California, and you were talking about their lack of educational opportunities, and it is significant. It's better than it was. Probably 10 years ago, they lost 800 teachers in the Department of Corrections in California. I don't think we have 800 in any of our institutions, let alone inmates in the institution, but the thought of losing 800 teachers would just completely dishearten anybody. And they struggled for a long, long time. California is starting to come back around a little bit to try and rebuild those programs, but they just hired inmates as tutors. CEA actually went out and talked with the legislature about trying to get at least some of those positions back, but apparently California was in such dire straits that there was just no way they could do that. But you think losing 800 teachers, that was vocational, that was ABE, that would just be absolutely horrible. And CEA did their best to try and convince the state of California that that was a stupid move. Didn't succeed. So I look forward to working with you guys some more. Like I said, Rachel and I had some conversations earlier that I really do want to get more involvement with post-secondary. It only makes sense because like when Susan and I met, it's like, if you're not open and you're not willing to talk to people and partner with people and figure out what she does versus what my responsibility was versus what the warden's responsibility is and how to make all those pieces fit. We did it with no money. We just kind of pulled up our bootstraps and kind of kept going. And I think that Pathways from Prison is an outstanding program for Wyoming. I was excited to be a part of it in the beginning, and I'm glad to see that it's going to continue. And I love that you guys are doing this, and I just appreciate the opportunity to come back. It's hard to take off that corrections hat once you've worn it for a long time. So it's nice to be part of this. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Betty. We have about 30 minutes to have a really solid conversation between our esteemed panelists and our audience. So I will turn it over to you folks. Who'd like to go first? Okay, go ahead. And maybe we could introduce ourselves as well.
Hi, I'm Anita McLaughlin with the Wyoming Community Foundation. So I do not work directly with programs. However, I assess and evaluate programs for funding. And I was just curious, I keep hearing quality programs. What are those, like, where would I find those standards so that I can look at an application and say, okay, they're saying they're doing this, and then have the checklist?
Thanks, Anita. It's a great question. So, I mean, part of, and hopefully I've represented this adequately, or maybe not, but part of the issue within this emerging field is that quality standards don't exist. So for higher education in prison, there's no universal unifying sense of what, or at least documented what quality practices are. And a lot of that is due to the nature of the field and how programs have emerged, again, in this nature of, or in a context of a lot of programs came about as sort of secret ventures within universities, or started by one faculty member teaching, one class or a book club, and then programs have grown in that capacity. But there's really never been a collective sense, especially among the practitioner community, for whether it's reasons of concern around the sustainability of programs, or this sense of competition amongst programs, that there was a real desire to collectively put some energy into creating even I don't want to say best practices, because I think that that's also challenging when we have such a diverse community of programs and practitioners. But there's a lot of effort now. There's some work being done to really put some energy into determining some, at least, parameters around what quality looks like for programs. And also to encourage practitioners and programs to really share resources and materials. I mean, that's part of the work of the Alliance. I mean, I think when the idea for the organization came into being, it really was this idea of sharing resources and allowing for a more, again, like networked approach to building this field. So ideally, that's sort of what comes in the near future, is a work that's a little more clearly defined effort to say what quality in this community and in this field looks like.
Mary, can I just add on to that? Hey, back here with a baby. Hi. Hi.
Aaron, please.
I want to give a shout out to the prospectus that was published in 2017 by the Alliance for Higher Ed in Prison, which outlines just some very basic kind of, I would say, parameters of quality. They might seem pretty obvious to, maybe folks who are working on college campuses. And then the other kind of just plug here is that we might not yet have empirical research, given the constraints of a prison environment, about specifically what constitutes quality higher education in prison, but we absolutely know what constitutes quality higher education. And so those things are available. If you look at things like high impact practices for students, right? We know that when a faculty member knows a student's name, that helps a student with self-efficacy, also helps their time to degree, right? And so that research is also available if you wanted to go outside of the field.
And I would just say, just Aaron, to that point, I think this question about sort of content and context, and this I think came up in Jody's presentation also, in thinking about the work and a lot of the efforts to define quality are not around creating an entirely new set of standards and process and practices and way to talk about higher education, but is an effort to take what we, as Aaron's saying, what we already know about what quality higher education is, and to think about it in the context of the prison, where there are some elements that do change the nature of our work, but it's never with the intention to say, here is the way you do a biology prison class, right? And so it's not higher education for prison. It's, kind of specifically higher education in prison. It's just what contextual issues might affect the way we do this work. But again, going back to like holistic and student-oriented outcomes, we have all of those already. For higher ed. We don't always see them implemented, and we don't always see them assessed or evaluated, So that's, again, I think our effort to do one better in some cases.
This is why CEA would love to partner with you guys, because it's a natural fit to make sure that everybody is on the same page. And I think doing that would really help every prison, current education programs, help the wardens understand, the administration understand what the benefit is. And I agree. I mean, recidivism, having worked in prison for a long time, recidivism was always the outcome. It wasn't necessarily my outcome, because in education you're looking at many different outcomes. In the end, that's how a lot of programs measure is recidivism rate. But when you look at behaviors in a prison, you look at self-efficacy, you look at the inmates talking today about having gotten their GED or high school equivalency and moving on and being brave enough to go into a college course. That's what you look at as an educator.
I have another question, Anita.
I was really inspired as well about making sure that your inmates, when they're entering into the world, you make sure that they have a laptop and an outfit to interview. Where did that culminate from, and where do you get funding from that?
Well, Hudson Link is, we're funded by private donations, so everything that we do inside the prison system comes from the generosity of funders. So that's just a component of our reentry program. It's what we decided to do to kind of help guys get on their feet when they get home. And we're also, just this past year, we bought a couple of houses that we've been renovating that are going to be used as homes for those who don't have a place to go. So that's another sector of reentry that Hudson Link is just starting to get into. So, and again, that's funded by private donations as well.
I just want to say that, again, because our organization started inside the prison and is now primarily, 75% of our staff is formerly incarcerated, which I think is worth mentioning. And a lot of the reentry needs, a lot of our reentry programming comes from the reentry needs of the people who came through our programs for the past 20 years. And I think that I've seen this trend too across the field, is that those of us who've been doing prison education programs inside have had to expand our reentry capacity because people are going home. I forget what we said, 850 alumni have come out of our Hudson Link sites. We're in 6 different prisons in the state. So we're growing, we can't keep up with it, which is a good problem, right? Like, we have people coming home, and I'll be the first person to say that having worked in maximum security facilities, for me, reentry was always like the finish line. Working with people who had 20, 30 years in, their release date was just like, I was so excited, just like, oh my God, then you're out. And having been at Hudson Link now, it's really opened my eyes to just how complicated reentry is. And again, as the contact inside the facility, what's really nice is being able to continue that relationship with a student post-release. And then also, I mean, I'm in 3 different of our sites. So when you're talking about 3 different pools of students coming home and all expecting to see you at the office when they get there to help them pick out that first suit, I just don't have the capacity to be there. So, I mean, our team does, and so we're continuously growing. And like Lee said, I mean, like, that's also why we got into the transitional housing field, is just the needs of our students. So we're constantly trying to keep up and respond to what people need when they come home. And that's one of the advantages too to working for a nonprofit. Like I said, I previously used to work for Marymount Manhattan College, who really defined their role as the educational provider. And while they would want to provide support and career counseling for students, it really wasn't within their expertise or ability or capacity to start providing reentry services. So the partnership of a college institution with maybe a nonprofit reentry could really provide that continued pathway for a student from inside post-release. And I kind of feel like that's where the future is, at least with our college partners. We partner with a bunch of different schools inside, and we have a presence inside the facility, and we continue that relationship with the student once they're home.
Hey, go ahead.
Thanks. Betty, I was wondering about the Correctional Education Association. So me, I'm not an educator, technically speaking. I teach a course at the Women's Center on mindfulness meditation. Am I somebody that might want to consider this type of association? And second question, is this an association that is or could be a clearinghouse for ideas that we're hearing about, to know what's happening with what Lee and Rachel are talking about and what we're doing here? And
yeah, I think we'd love to have you. And part of the reason for that is it would help you to get to know other people in other states and have that access to other people and what they're doing in different states. The other thing that I would encourage any of you to do is to apply. We have a conference in the end of July. It's in Detroit. I would encourage any of you to apply to do a presentation, because that's how you get that information out. That's how you share that information. Susan and I have done presentations. She's actually doing some research right now for CEA and with CEA, and so sharing that information, Susan, to my understanding, will be there this summer to present on her findings. So all this information is helpful. And again, we'll do strands where it's juvenile or adult, or it's special ed, or it's adult basic ed, or it's college, or it's vocational training. There's a lot involved in this. And again, like I said, we're coming back from a very trying financial time. We're in a much, much better place than we ever were. We would love to be able to be a type of clearinghouse, or at least a way to bring people together to share that information, which is what most of the conferences are, is to share that information. We work with quite a few different universities. Ashland University out of Ohio has been doing programming in prisons for forever. They're one of the biggest providers right now with the Pell Grant. And they're providing Louisiana, Ohio, there's a couple of other states. And so the Pell Grant has opened up some of those conversations some for the post-secondary and the college program. So we would love to have you join. We would love to have you come and present, presenting what you did. Because what you did, because I remember when Susan and Alec came to me, I'm like, okay, explain to me how this is going to be good. And I'm the doubter. Alec will tell you, I'm kind of the doubter. It's like, no, you tell me why this is going to work and how this is going to help in a prison system. And when you can do that and articulate that, and then you can see the results, like doing the stoic step back for our inmates up in Newcastle, and the stuff that you did, it's like, okay, I get it. You know, because I'm very practical, and for me, the programs that we instituted were very practical. I wanted them to get out and get a job. I wanted them to be successful. I wanted the community to be safe, because if they're successful, the community is safe. And so that was my perception. And so this actually opened up my mind to a lot of other opportunities that never, quite frankly, in a million years would I ever have thought, well, yeah, let's do some of this. Because, I mean, Alec can tell you, when he told me that, I'm like, what? Are you kidding me? So we had some conversations about it. But sharing that information about what works in different states, and Wyoming in some ways is easier to do things, in some ways much more difficult. The feds don't recognize us as a viable grant recipient because we're so small. We don't have those big numbers. And I've had this argument with the feds. I actually did this in DC and told the feds that, you know, what they didn't realize was we're not in places like California where you can send people to the same community and track them. It's Wyoming. You can't do that. And I reminded them that there's more antelope in this state than there are people, and they kind of laughed. And I'm like, no, I'm serious. And so sharing that information about what works in other states is what made the programs here and what helped us with pathways to make things successful. So absolutely.
Just to jump in on that as well, I think, and maybe this is also one of the threads that sort of carried throughout the presentations and maybe throughout this event as well, is that a number of us are talking about the idea of collaborations and thinking and working together. And I do think that that's really the way forward for so many of our programs and groups. And I specifically really want to focus on this idea of networks as well. But I also think that it's also important to talk about and openly engage the distinctions as well. And so, you know, in thinking about the formation of the Alliance for Higher Education in Prison was very specifically around this idea of creating space and opportunities for people teaching and learning in the context of higher education and higher education in prison, recognizing that historically the work of higher education in prison was not distinguished, or often was just sort of lumped in with everything that happened in a prison related to education. And that was not capturing the work adequately, and it was not creating a space for people teaching or practitioners of programs to form community. And there was also a great detriment to the work of higher education in prison. And so when higher education and the purpose of higher education becomes reduced to, or solely focused as a point of like reducing recidivism, that inherently diminishes the purpose of higher education. And there are ways, and I think that this was noted throughout the conversations already this morning, that the work of higher education is distinct from the work of corrections. And I think that those are important distinctions to recognize, and I think they're important conversations to have. And it doesn't diminish the ability to collaborate, but I do think that there has to be some recognition on both sides that the partners in this situation are coming from different perspectives and might be working to different ends as well. And there's a real, I think, need for that conversation and need to look at, like the RAND report, I think is a really good place to look and say, yes, I think that RAND's work and research focused in education in prison might have been beneficial for corrections, but it was not beneficial to people working in higher education. And we spent years trying to counteract or de-weaponize reporting that was put out, and we still often, any journalist even writing about higher education right now will often cite statistics straight from the RAND report, which are not indicative of the work of higher education or even useful for educators in prison. So again, I think the distinctions are important. I think we should be having these conversations. Corrections should be talking with folks in higher ed, and we don't have to agree on everything, but we work together, we form partnerships, and it's a really important part of the work. And that there are, I think my final plug is that, and as Jody mentioned as well, there are programs who are not just working with incarcerated students. A program I worked with for many years at St. Louis University is also doing programming for staff at correctional institutions. So it's not just a cut and dry, we're higher education teachers or practitioners, and we're only working with incarcerated students. There's a history of working with staff as well, and obviously a history of strong partnerships.
I have the mic. So, a couple of things I just wanted to say real quick. It's really nice to hear that it sounds like CEA is going through a kind of rebirth, and it's just great to hear. And I was thinking about probably at least 15 years ago, I went to a CEA conference. I don't even know what town I was in, maybe San Antonio or something. I don't know where I was. But I remember I guess it was more because I was brand new to the field. It was probably like 2001 or something. But, and I was very put off at the time. And I was really just kind of learning about the culture of corrections in my state. But I was very put off at the time by the way a lot of the folks there who were from all over the country, and they also included a lot of vendors, right? Not necessarily just educators. It was kind of an interesting trade show, sort of in a sense, or scene. But a lot of the language that folks there used, particularly also from the recovery community, which I thought of as like, people who really have intense compassion. There was sort of the business version of the treatment and recovery world there represented. And there was a lot of very disturbingly degrading language around incarcerated students, just sort of talking about them as if they were kindergartners, basically. And when I talk about that sort of like the subspecies or diagnostic category, the they or the them, or the games inmates play, like very kind of othering kind of language. Anyway, but it strikes me that was a really formative time for me. I don't think it was representative of the whole organization, but there were folks there, at the time who were just very immersed in that culture, mostly in their states. Anyway, but the other thing I was going to say is that
I think part of where the Alliance kind of, or the energy around the Alliance for Higher Education in Prison kind of came about was that there were a lot of folks in the field who really felt like, really everything that Mary was just saying, that, and also Lee and Rachel, that there are these real tensions in the field, right? That there are folks who are involved in this work, but really have some very disparaging views and really see education as, for prisoners, as this other thing. And so I guess I just think it struck me when we talk about correctional education, I remember at the time thinking, what is correctional education? And I think in a sense, like, that's really what a lot of this comes down to, as we, like you're all saying, try to understand where we are, what our expertise is, what our goals and objectives are. And then also to recognize it's not just that we have different cultures or different missions, but we're all subject to different political pressures and different variables. There are different audiences for our work. And I think what we need is just these spaces where we can be open and reflect on, we may not be identical. We may not have the exact same goals, but where we can at least see, like, where are the points of alliance, or or of commonality, so that we can collaborate together. But I'm sorry that's such a long-winded comment, but it's really nice to see all of you together. And then the only other thing I was going to say, I'm not sure, so Mary and a colleague of ours and I have been working on a report on best practices in the field of higher education in prison, which is not yet out, but where we have begun to try to tackle this question of what does quality look like, but in the spirit that Mary was expressing, without being prescriptive. And I think that is kind of in other words, saying, this is what we're thinking breeds excellence. This is what elevates students, lifts them up, helps them achieve their potential, creates real community. But I think, again, like, these are the questions that we all can, I guess, agree that we need the space and time to reflect on. Sorry, that was so long here.
Do you want me to ask my question now? Well, thanks ever so much. I mean, Hudson, I think you've said a lot of things there that I was thinking. My guys be nodding along to everything you were saying. It was really interesting. So stuff about alumni support on the way out, the non-supervised study rooms, all of that stuff. That's exactly what they want. So that was really opened my eyes to kind of like that potential. Thank you. I just had a question which is very similar to yours, actually, but it's slightly different in that, and it's primarily to you, Mary. When you have different practices going on, and they've all got best practice, so I think of like maybe Bard College Prison Initiative, and their idea is just transplant the college into the prison, wholesale. Don't mess with it. That's how you're going to get most kind of bang for your buck. And then look at Inside Out, and it's all about kind of radical pedagogy, and how we have to have non-hierarchical teaching space. Now, they both act through goodwill, but they're going to be coming into quite strong conflict about best method there. So can the Alliance provide some kind of mediation system for that? Is that something that you're interested in? Is that a plan? Is that part of what you're providing, or is that a second stage concern?
Yeah, so I think in the process of answering this question, and I think to Jody's comment about we will be putting out a report on, we're not even using the term best practice, sort of practices in the field. Actually, the bulk of the report will be divided between practices and challenges. And I think, again, that's very representative of the spirit of how we are approaching field building. Again, to not have a prescriptive, this is the one way, or sort of a top down, but really to be descriptive and to think, like, as a community of practice, can we all share resources, experiences, materials, opportunities? Certainly there are guiding principles. I mean, as Aaron Castro has pointed out, we know how to do higher education well. Can we take these practices and see them in the context of the prison while potentially being agnostic to even method of delivery? We spend a lot of time in the field talking about distance learning, on-site versus a computer or tablet. We spent time with the report talking about, do we have a section on distance learning? Do we have a section on Inside Out? Do we make statements for it? And we thought, well, let's try to be agnostic about anything. 2-year, 4-year, private, public school. There are practices within higher education that have been determined, or that we have experience and understand to be best for student learning and outcomes. So this is just a way of saying that our initial approach in the Alliance is very much still in a infrastructure and launch phase. But the approach is, let's be as descriptive as possible, as community oriented, as agnostic to type or mode, and let's see how we can do. Let's see how we do together. Let's see how we can share resources, best practices. Let's not rush you. We've had questions like, will there be an accreditation? Will there be a checklist or a stamp of approval? Maybe in the future, one day, who knows? But for right now, it's just let's generate the conversation. Let's draw on some of the resources that we already have. People have been doing this work in the field for years, the evidence and data that's been collected. Let's start there and see where we end up.
Barry, I think we'll go ahead and stop there because we're about at time. Any additional comments from our panelists? Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. And we're going to go ahead and transition right away into Alec and Michelle's conversation in 5 minutes.
After 5 minutes, here you go.
We'll take a 5-minute break.